There is a mountain on the border between Syria and Lebanon that rises 2,814 meters into the cold air. Tonight, in the dark, there is snow on it. There is a ski resort on its southern slopes, and at the very top, inside a United Nations buffer zone, there is a small manned outpost, the highest permanently staffed United Nations position anywhere in the world. Soldiers sit in it through the night, watching 3 countries at once. They are not the first ones to stand on that summit and look down at the world. Picture yourself there now, not in the outpost, outside it, the wind moving over old stone. Below you, the lights of villages scattered across the plain like embers going out one by one. Above you, more stars than a city ever lets you see. And beneath your feet, limestone laid down under an ancient sea, worn smooth by 100,000 winters. The stone is cold. You can feel the cold through your boots, through the soles, rising into the arch of your foot. The mountain does not notice you. It has been here for much longer than anything that has ever stood on it. This mountain is called Hermon, and there is a book, one of the oldest books that survives from the world before the Bible was assembled, which says that this is the place where it happened, that 200 of them came down here, not to visit, to stay, and that before they came down, standing together on this summit in the dark, they swore an oath to each other. They bound themselves to it, all 200, so that none could turn back, and none could betray the others. The text says the mountain took its name from that oath, the Hebrew root from which both words descend. The oath and the mountain carries the meaning of a thing devoted, a thing consecrated, a thing from which there is no return. Remember the oath they swore on the mountain. It comes back at the end of the night. They are called the Watchers, and the book says they brought things down with them. Knowledge, mostly. How to work metal into blades. How to read the movements of the stars and call it prophecy. How to cut roots for medicine, and for other purposes. The book is very specific about who taught what, as if someone kept a record, as if someone was taking minutes at a meeting none of us were invited to. And it says that what followed was so catastrophic that the whole thing had to be undone. Not undone by flood. That comes later, and everybody knows that story. Undone by burial, because according to the Book of Enoch, the Watchers were not destroyed, they were not killed, and they were not sent home. They were bound, hand and foot, and put into an opening in the earth, in a place the text names but never locates, and covered over with rough stones and darkness, and left there. Not for a generation, not for an age. The instruction, as it survives, is, until the day of judgment. A civilization wrote down, in careful detail, the coordinates of its own imprisoned gods, and then lost the map. So tonight, the question we are going to follow all the way down is this. What does the Book of Enoch actually say is buried beneath the earth? And why does it insist it was sealed there, rather than simply ended? 200. Hold that number. We will come back to it more than once, in more languages than you might expect. Before we go any further, let me say something important. You don't need to follow every word tonight. Some of it will reach you, and some of it won't, and that is exactly right. This is not a test. This is not a lecture. These questions are old ones. Ancient, genuinely ancient, and they are the kind that carry you downward slowly, without urgency, without the feeling that you are falling behind. So if you find yourself drifting somewhere in the middle of the manuscript history, or losing the thread around the oath on the mountain, or simply arriving somewhere warm and dark where the words are just texture and sound, that is not failure. That is the beginning of something. This kind of night is made for a specific kind of person, for the ones who read the footnotes before the chapter, for the ones who stay long past the end of a documentary, replaying the part that unsettled them, for anyone who has ever thought, what else was written down, and what did they decide to set aside, and why, and who made that decision. You are in the right place. Tonight you have no obligations. You are here after whatever the day required of you, And now it is quiet, and that is enough. Nothing is required of you. The story will move at its own pace, and wherever you are when the morning comes, whether you heard all of it or only the beginning, you will have rested. One question before we go down. Where in the world are you tonight? What hour marks the beginning of your sleep? Leave it in the comments. Someone is listening from the edge of a Tuesday morning in Tokyo. Someone in Sao Paulo with the rain on. Someone in Edinburgh just after midnight. Someone in the desert somewhere, where the stars look the way they must have looked from Hermon. I read those in the mornings, and I want to know where all of you are. And if this kind of evening is useful to you, a quiet tap on like or a subscribe, that is the only way I ask. The rest of the night is yours. Let us begin with what we know for certain. Not the claims that require faith or imagination. Those will come later, and we will handle them with appropriate care. Let us start with the object itself, what this book is, where it came from, what form it takes, and how it reached us. These are questions with verifiable answers, and they are worth taking slowly before we descend. The Book of Enoch is not one book. It is 5, gathered under a single name, a library in miniature, composed across several centuries in the ancient Jewish world of the Second Temple period, and attributed, as ancient collections often were, to the most prestigious possible authorship. In this case, a figure from the oldest pages of the Hebrew tradition, Enoch, the 7th generation from Adam, a man of whom the Bible itself says almost nothing, that he lived 365 years, which is suspiciously solar in its precision, that he fathered a son named Methuselah, who holds a different kind of record, and then, in one of the shortest and most pregnant sentences in the Hebrew canon, he walked with God, and he was not, for God took him, not died, was not, taken, no burial, no illness recorded, no account of a final day, no grave that any tradition has located, just the extraordinary, compressed fact of his not being, and the implication that his not being was different from the way that everyone else eventually was not. That gap, that absence where a death should be, was enough. For centuries of writers, across multiple traditions, it was an invitation. What did Enoch see? Where did he go? What was he told in the time between his walking with God and his not being? The Book of Enoch is the collected answer. The 5 sections of the complete collection are the Book of the Watchers, chapters 1 through 36, the Book of Parables, or the Similitudes, chapters 37 through 71, the Astronomical Book, also called the Book of the Luminaries, chapters 72 through 82, the Book of Dream Visions, chapters 83 through 90, and the Epistle of Enoch, chapters 91 through 108. Each of these sections has its own character, its own concerns, its own likely period of composition. They are not one document, they are a tradition, a gathering of Enochic material, diverse in origin, unified in attribution. Tonight, we are concerned only with the first and oldest of these 5. The Book of the Watchers, chapters 1 through 36. The part that scholars, on the basis of the manuscript evidence and the internal character of the text, date to roughly the 3rd or 4th century before the Common Era. Written originally in Aramaic, the language of commerce and communication across the ancient Near East, the everyday tongue of Jewish communities in the Second Temple period, the language in which much of the later books of Daniel and Ezra are composed. Not classical Hebrew, which by that period was increasingly a language of liturgy and formal scripture. Aramaic, the working language of the world that produced this text. And then, somewhere in the first centuries of the Common Era, it began to slip from the mainstream of what became Western Christianity. Not dramatically, not banned or condemned in any single moment of official action, simply deprioritized, set aside, and eventually, as the canons of the major Western and Eastern churches solidified across the early medieval centuries, not included. Except in one place. In the highlands of East Africa, the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, one of the oldest continuous Christian traditions in the world, tracing its unbroken institutional lineage to the 4th century, when the bishop Frumentius was consecrated and baptized. The Emperor Ezana of Aksum kept this book. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church maintained, and has maintained for 16 centuries, a canon of scripture substantially broader than the canons of Rome or Constantinople or Canterbury. Their Bible includes texts that no other major Christian tradition considers scripture, and the Book of Enoch is among them, not in a footnote, not in a secondary tier, but fully canonical. Read in the same services as Genesis, as the Psalms, as the Gospels. For over 1,000 years, while European scholarship debated whether this book had ever existed in a complete form, Ethiopian priests were reading it aloud in Ge'ez. The Ge'ez language is the classical ecclesiastical language of Ethiopia, ancient, sacred, no longer spoken as a mother tongue, but maintained across 16 centuries of liturgical use, with a fidelity that has few parallels anywhere in the world. It is the vehicle through which the Book of Enoch came to the modern world. And the entire reason we have a complete text today, every word of all 5 sections, the full narrative from the first vision through to the final epistle, is that Ethiopia preserved it. This is the first thing worth knowing. The survival of this book is itself a story worth sitting with. In 1768, a Scottish explorer named James Bruce set out for Abyssinia, the older name for Ethiopia. Bruce was a remarkable figure by any standard of his era, physically imposing, over 6 feet tall at a time when this was unusual and noticeable, educated in ways that combined gentleman scholar breadth with genuine field capability. He was driven by a specific scholarly curiosity about the source of the Blue Nile, which his contemporaries had debated without resolution. His expedition, which he undertook independently and funded largely from his own resources, took him through Egypt, Eritrea, and deep into Ethiopia itself. He spent years there, departing in 1768 and not returning to Europe until 1773, in territory that very few Europeans of his generation had visited and survived. He reached the source of the Blue Nile at Lake Tana in November of 1770. That was the stated goal, but he came back with something else as well. 3 handwritten Ge'ez manuscripts of the Book of Enoch. He brought them to a Europe that had largely concluded the book existed only as a rumor, a document cited in other ancient texts, quoted in fragments by Byzantine historians, but otherwise considered lost, inaccessible, perhaps not recoverable. Bruce presented one of his manuscripts to the Bodleian Library at Oxford. A second went to the French Royal Library in Paris. The third he retained in his own collection, which also eventually found its way to the Bodleian. For roughly half a century, the Oxford manuscript sat on a shelf, studied occasionally, not yet translated into any modern language. In 1821, a professor of Hebrew at Oxford, Richard Lawrence, who held the Regius Chair of Hebrew at Christ Church and would later become the Archbishop of Cashel in Ireland, opened that manuscript and did something that required considerable patience and a willingness to acquire expertise in a language he had not begun with. Ge'ez is not Hebrew. It is a Semitic language, distantly related, but distinct enough to require genuine study. Lawrence did the work, and in 1821 he published the first English translation of the complete Book of Enoch in living memory, the first time the full text had been available in English, accessible to the general reading public, since before the medieval period. Most of the scholarly world, upon receiving it, did not know quite what to make of it. Here is the detail that almost no popular retelling pauses on. The Book of Enoch is quoted by name in the New Testament, not alluded to, not thematically echoed, quoted directly, with attribution, in a way that any ancient reader would have recognized as a formal citation. In the Epistle of Jude, verses 14 and 15, The author writes, Enoch, the seventh from Adam, prophesied about them. See, the Lord is coming with tens of thousands of his holy ones, to execute judgment on all, and to convict everyone of all the deeds of ungodliness that they have committed in such an ungodly way, and of all the harsh things that ungodly sinners have spoken against him. That is the first chapter of the Book of Enoch, verse 9, rendered in the New Testament as inspired prophecy, as authoritative speech, with the source named and the author identified. The author of Jude knew this book, treated it as having the weight of prophecy, quoted it as the foundation for a theological argument. And then, in the centuries that followed, the traditions that preserved Jude did not preserve Enoch, except in Ethiopia. Hold that tension. It is a real one, and we will not resolve it tonight. What we will do is follow what the book actually says, and the strange specific thing that its survival in archaeology tells us about how old it really is. Because in 1947, and again in 1952, something arrived from a cave near the Dead Sea that changed this story entirely. Something written in a language nobody had expected, in a hand that the tests of paleography placed 2,000 years in the past, proving something about this book that it had not previously been possible to prove. It is worth pausing on what the Second Temple period actually was, and why it matters for understanding where this book came from. The Second Temple, the Great Jerusalem Temple rebuilt by Zerubbabel and later expanded by Herod, stood from roughly the 6th century before the Common Era until its destruction by the Romans in 70 CE. The period of its standing was one of the most intellectually and spiritually productive in the entire history of Judaism. It was during this period that the Hebrew Bible took much of the shape we know it in. And it was during this period that an extraordinary proliferation of other texts that did not make it into the biblical canon, texts that addressed questions the canonical texts left open, were composed, debated, copied, and preserved. The Book of Enoch is one of these texts, but it was not alone. The Second Temple period produced a whole library of writings that scholars group under the name of the pseudepigrapha, texts written under the name of a famous ancient figure, in the style of an ancient document, addressing questions that were alive in the writer's own time. Books of Adam, books of Abraham, books of the 12 patriarchs, all of them doing what the Book of Enoch does, taking a silence where the reader might have questions, and filling it with the answers that the writer believed were needed. What makes the Book of Enoch distinctive within this literature, and what accounts for its extraordinary transmission history, its survival in Ethiopia, its discovery at Qumran, its adoption by the Manichaeans, is the specific character of the questions it asks and the answers it provides. It does not fill in a gap about what Abraham said to God on a particular afternoon. It fills in a gap about where evil came from, and it does so in a way that is, by any measure, extraordinarily systematic. It is not content to say, evil came from fallen angels. It specifies who those angels were, what each of them taught, what happened as a result, what the legal proceedings looked like, who was assigned to carry out the sentence, and where the sentence is currently being carried out. That level of procedural detail is unusual even within the pseudepigrapha. It is one of the reasons the text has never been forgotten. Before we reach it, hold this. Around the 14th minute of tonight, I planted a seed. One entire section of this book has never been found outside Ethiopia. Not a fragment, not a single line on parchment or leather, anywhere in the world except in those Ge'ez manuscripts. We will come back to what that absence means, and why some scholars find it more interesting than anything that survived. For now, the caves where the book was waiting, in Aramaic, in a hand 2,000 years old, for the moment when the right stone would be thrown into the right jar. The winter of 1946 to 1947 in the Judean desert was cold and dry, as it usually is. A young Bedouin shepherd, the accounts differ on his exact name. The most consistent version gives it as Muhammad ed-Dib, and he was perhaps 15 or 16 years old, was moving along the cliff face above a site called Khirbet Qumran, near the northwest shore of the Dead Sea, searching for a stray goat. He found, in the limestone, a narrow opening he had not noticed before. He threw a stone inside to test the depth. He heard not a thud, but a crack, the sound of ceramic breaking. He went back with a companion, and they climbed in. What they found were tall clay storage jars, sealed, containing leather scrolls wrapped in linen. They did not know what the scrolls said. They brought them out, brought them to Bethlehem, and eventually sold them through an antiquities dealer in Jerusalem. Word spread slowly, through a wartime region, through political upheaval, through the channels that knowledge takes when it has to move across borders, and through people who are uncertain what they have. By 1948, scholars were beginning to understand that something extraordinary had surfaced from the Judean wilderness. Over the following years, systematic searches of the cliff face above Qumran found 11 caves. Together, they yielded perhaps 900 manuscripts, most of them in fragments, most of them in Aramaic or Hebrew, copied and composed across the period spanning roughly the 3rd century before the Common Era through the 1st century of the Common Era. The site was, in all probability, a library belonging to a Jewish community that had lived and worked in the Qumran settlement until its destruction in the 1st century. When the community knew the end was coming, when the Roman legions were approaching, they sealed their manuscripts in jars, carried them to the caves, and left them. They left them for nearly 2,000 years. The cave designated Cave 4, first explored in 1952, was the richest single deposit ever found. Tens of thousands of fragments from over 500 manuscripts, covering the floor of a cave that had sat sealed in the dry Judean air. A French Dominican priest and paleographer named Joseph Milik worked through the Cave 4 material across years and decades, meticulously piecing leather to leather under magnification, reconstructing texts from scraps the size of fingernails. It was among the most demanding scholarly work of the 20th century. And among the Cave 4 material, Milik identified something the world had not previously held in its hands: Aramaic manuscripts of the Book of Enoch, 11 of them, designated in the scholarly catalogue as 4Q201 through 4Q212, the numeral indicating their cave and the letter their position within the corpus. The oldest of these, the manuscript 4Q201, in a careful professional scribal hand, has been dated by paleographic analysis to approximately 200 years before the Common Era. Some of the fragments may be slightly older still. 200 years before the Common Era, before the birth of Christianity, before the compilation of the Gospels, before the letters of Paul were written, before Richard Lawrence sat in Oxford with his Gayes manuscript in 1821. 200 years before all of that, a scribe was sitting somewhere in the Judean world, in a scriptorium, at a reed-lit table, in whatever working conditions the Second Temple period afforded, and copying the Book of Enoch onto leather in Aramaic. The fragments themselves are, in physical presence, almost brutally modest objects. The leather is dark and brittle, the colour of old wood or dried mud. Individual pieces are no larger than a thumbnail. The text runs in a careful square script, what paleographers call the square Aramaic script of the Second Temple period. Dense and small, with lacunae everywhere, gaps where the leather split along the fold lines, where the edge crumbled away, where time and moisture and insects took their share. You cannot read these manuscripts without years of training and proper equipment. They are not beautiful objects in any obvious sense. They are the kind of thing that requires the entire apparatus of modern scholarship: paleography, linguistics, chemistry, comparative textual analysis, simply to speak at all. But what they say is irreplaceable. This text is genuinely ancient. It did not grow out of Christian tradition. It was not composed in a medieval scriptorium and then read backward into history, it was circulating widely in the Second Temple Jewish world, copied by multiple hands, preserved in multiple manuscripts in at least one community's library. The Ethiopic Ge'ez version that Bruce brought out of Abyssinia, produced from a Greek intermediary, which was itself translated from the Aramaic, is a faithful descendant of a document that is demonstrably pre-Christian. Before Milik published his full analysis in 1976, 24 years after the Cave 4 excavation, that fact could not be proven by external physical evidence. After 1976 it could, 24 years between discovery and publication. The delay was partly the extraordinary difficulty of working with fragmentary leather in a dead script. You cannot simply read off a list of contents. Partly the political complications of the region, through which custody of the fragments changed hands and access was complicated. Partly the slow, methodical nature of philological scholarship at this level. 24 years. The fragments cover roughly 1/5 of the complete Ethiopic text, which means that 4/5 of the original Aramaic tradition is simply gone, not hidden, not locked away, but lost to the silence that takes most of what human beings write. The manuscripts we have are the survivors of a much larger tradition, almost all of which has been absorbed back into the earth it came from. Now, let us look at what those fragments, and the Ethiopic text they confirm, actually say happened. 1 Enoch, chapter 6. The translation is R.H. Charles's from 1912, and it is the version that most scholars of the English tradition know. And it came to pass when the children of men had multiplied, that in those days were born unto them beautiful and comely daughters. And the angels, the children of the heaven, saw and lusted after them, and said to one another, Come, let us choose us wives from among the children of men, and beget us children. And Semjaza, who was their leader, said unto them, I fear ye will not indeed agree to do this deed, and I alone shall have to pay the penalty of this great sin. And they all answered him and said, Let us all swear an oath, and all bind ourselves by mutual imprecations, not to abandon this plan, but to do this thing. Then swear they all together, and bound themselves by mutual imprecations upon it. And they were in all 200, who descended in the days of Jared on the summit of Mount Hermon. And they called it Mount Hermon, because they had sworn and bound themselves by mutual imprecations upon it. 200. Hold that number. The oath, the summit, the mutual imprecation, the word that means a curse laid upon oneself, the binding that cannot be broken because breaking it would activate the curse on the one who breaks it, the mountain named for what happened on it. The text supplies its own etymology. Hermon, from Herem, the Hebrew word for a ban, a devoted thing, a sacred and untouchable oath. And then the book does something unusual. It lists them. It gives 20 names, 20 leaders, each commanding 10 of the 200, and it does not give them ranks in a military hierarchy. It gives them subjects, responsibilities, a teaching portfolio, as if you were looking at the roster of a faculty. Azazel, rendered as Asael in some of the Aramaic manuscripts, taught humanity to make swords and knives and shields and breastplates. He taught the working of iron and copper and gold. He taught also the making of bracelets, ornaments, and the art of the eye, the colouring of the eyelids with antimony, the refinement of cosmetics, the ornamentation of the self. The text gives these two things, weapons and beauty, under the same teacher, in the same passage, without comment. They are the same kind of disclosure. Both are forms of working the materials of the world into extensions of human power. Semjaza taught enchantments and the cutting of roots. Armoros taught the dissolving of enchantments, the counter-knowledge, the defense against Semjaza's subject. Barakajal taught astrology, the reading of the stars for meanings, the interpretation of planetary movement as information about earthly events. Kokabel taught the reading of the constellations, the larger patterns, the fixed stars in their groupings. Ezekiel taught the knowledge of clouds, which in the ancient Near East was the art of reading weather as portent, reading the sky as a message about what is coming. Arakiel taught the signs of the earth. Shamsiel taught the signs of the sun. Sariel the course of the moon. Read this list slowly in the dark, and something about it becomes peculiar in a way that is difficult to shake. It reads not like mythology. Mythology is not usually this granular about administrative assignment. This reads like a personnel file, like the minutes of a faculty meeting. Who taught what in which specialized domain, assigned to which constituency? The text cares very much that you know the specific assignments. Not just that knowledge was given, but who gave each component of it, and what each component was. Most accounts of this story stop at the crime. They describe the fall, the union, the giants, and move on to the flood. But the interesting part, the part that has kept this text alive in scholarly debate across 2,000 years, is not the crime. It is what the crime required in response, and the mechanism that was built to respond to it. Because what comes next is where the Book of the Watchers distinguishes itself from every other ancient text that tells a similar story. It does not simply punish the transgression, it builds a legal procedure, and the legal procedure produces a document, and the document names a place. That place is the one you need to carry with you from this moment until the 83rd minute of tonight. In the sentence that is eventually passed, the formal legal verdict, the binding instruction that comes down from the highest authority in the text's cosmological hierarchy, a place is named. One place in one desert, given a specific name and no other identifier. The name is Dudale. The text says, make an opening in the desert. It is called Dudale, and cast him therein. That is the entire geographical description. One name, no landmark, no direction, no distance from any known point. Just the name. Let us take a moment, before we follow what the text says, to sit with the physical reality of what these Qumran manuscripts represent. The earliest manuscript, 4Q201, survives in pieces ranging from the size of a large notebook page at its largest to the size of a fingernail at its smallest. The leather was treated in the ancient manner, soaked, dried, ruled with faint lines to guide the scribe, and inscribed with a reed pen cut to a specific angle, dipped in ink made from carbon black and gum Arabic. The script is what paleographers call the early Herodian Jewish hand, the professional writing standard of the late Second Temple period. Someone sat down in a room whose light came from oil lamps and wrote this text. One letter at a time, one word at a time, each letter carefully formed, not written quickly but inscribed deliberately, the way professional scribes inscribed texts that were meant to last. This person was copying from an earlier manuscript, which itself was copied from an even earlier one. The text they were copying had probably been circulating for at least a century by the time they sat down with their pen. They did not know they were producing a document that would be sealed in a cave, missed by every tradition except Ethiopia, rediscovered by a shepherd 2,000 years later, and read aloud to someone listening in the dark on the other side of the world. They simply believed this was worth keeping. The discovery of the Aramaic fragments also clarified something that had been uncertain since Richard Lawrence's 1821 publication. The Ethiopic text that Lawrence translated was produced from a Greek translation, which was itself produced from the Aramaic. Every translation introduces changes. The question that scholars had asked since 1821 was, how faithful is the Ethiopic text to whatever the original was? The Qumran fragments gave the first firm answer, remarkably faithful. The places where the Aramaic survives and can be compared to the Ethiopic show a high degree of consistency. The Ethiopic Church, preserving this text for 16 centuries in liturgical use, preserved it accurately. There is a detail in the text of 1 Enoch 6 that is easy to miss in a quick reading, but that becomes more significant the longer you sit with it. The oath is not just an oath of solidarity, It is a mutual imprecation. Each of the 200 is calling down a curse upon themselves if they betray the others. The binding is achieved not through external enforcement, but through self-directed consequence. If you break the oath, the curse you called upon yourself activates. The mountain is named for this self-directed consequence. Hermon, from Herem, the thing devoted to destruction. The mountain carries the name of what was risked on it. The mutual self-damnation of 200 beings who knew they could not turn back once the oath was sworn. Remember it. Dudael. We will spend considerable time with it before this night is over. But first, the mechanism. The thing that sets the Book of the Watchers apart from the stories it resembles. Because before the sentence is delivered, something unprecedented happens. The Watchers, learning that judgment is coming, seek legal representation, and the being they choose to represent them is a human being. There is a temptation, when a text is old enough and strange enough, to assume it must mean exactly what it says, or, alternatively, to assume it cannot possibly mean what it says, and must therefore mean something else entirely. Neither of these is the most interesting reading, and neither of them is the one that the best scholarship on this text would recommend. So let us put 3 lenses on the table, and look at the Book of the Watchers through each of them, fairly, without forcing a conclusion, and without the winking skepticism that treats the disclaimer as a formality. The first lens is the one most historians of the ancient world would reach for. The Book of the Watchers was composed during the Second Temple period, roughly the 3rd or 4th century before the Common Era, in the Jewish world of the ancient Near East. This was a time of considerable cultural pressure and considerable cultural anxiety. Greek culture, what the ancient world called Hellenism, had spread eastward with extraordinary speed, following the campaigns of Alexander the Great in the 4th century. Greek became the language of administration, of philosophy, of public life across a vast swath of territory that included Judea and the surrounding region. With the language came a package of practices, aesthetics, and ideas that many Jewish communities found simultaneously threatening and seductive. Foreign knowledge, foreign gods, foreign marriages. The mixing of cultures that conservative communities have always found alarming, not because the foreign element is necessarily evil, but because the mixing itself is destabilizing. The categories break down, the borders blur. And when the borders blur, a tradition that has defined itself through the maintenance of those borders faces an identity crisis. From this vantage, the Watcher's story is legible as a theological argument in narrative form. Where did evil come from? The monotheistic answer, that a single all-powerful God created everything, creates an immediate philosophical problem. If that is true, why is the world broken? Why is there violence, suffering, the misuse of knowledge, the technologies of harm, alongside the technologies of beauty? The Watchers offer a solution that does not require God to be the author of evil. Evil entered through a specific event. It has a history. It has actors who can be named and assigned responsibility. And, crucially, those actors have already been dealt with. They are already sentenced. The verdict is already passed. The handling has already occurred. This is an enormously useful thing to tell a community living under foreign occupation, watching its cultural distinctives erode at the edges, uncertain about how much of the surrounding world it is acceptable to absorb. Whatever knowledge has entered from outside, whatever practices have been taken up that perhaps should not have been, there is a framework for understanding where it came from and what has been done about it. The God of this tradition is not surprised. The case is in hand. The worst thing that happened is already contained. This reading, the scholarly mainstream reading, treats the Watchers not as literal history, but as theology and as politics. It is the interpretation most consistently offered by historians of Second Temple Judaism, and it is the most defensible account of what the text was doing in its original social context. It does not require any supernatural being to have been real. It requires only that the story was useful to the community that told it. which, as a matter of historical record, it demonstrably was for a very long time. The second lens is comparative, because the pattern inside the Book of the Watchers, sky beings who descend, who bring the knowledge and tools of civilization to humanity, and who are then punished for having done so, is not unique to this tradition. It appears, in recognizably similar forms, across cultures that did not have straightforward access to one another. In Mesopotamia, the civilizational world immediately adjacent to the one that produced the Book of Enoch, the world whose literature and mythology the Jewish tradition knew well, the antediluvian sages are called the Apkallu. They are 7 figures, depicted in Babylonian art as hybrid beings, sometimes fish-cloaked, sometimes winged, sent by the god Ea, or Enki, to bring the arts of civilization to humanity before the flood. They teach writing, craftsmanship, architecture, the keeping of law, the reading of omens, and in certain Mesopotamian traditions, the Apkallu are not entirely benign figures. They are ambiguous, standing at the boundary between the divine knowledge that is permitted and the divine knowledge that is dangerous. Scholars like Amar Annis have argued, in detailed academic studies, that the Watcher's story is best understood as a deliberate counter-narrative to the Apkallu tradition, the same basic structure, inverted, where the Apkallu are sent by a god and their teaching is, at least officially, sanctioned. The Watchers descend against orders and their teaching is explicitly transgressive. In Greek tradition, the story of Prometheus is the clearest analogue in the Western canon. He steals fire, which is to say technology, the controlled use of energy, the thing that separates human beings from the animal world in the Greek understanding, from the gods, and gives it to humanity. And he is punished, not killed, not dissolved, bound, chained to a rock in a specific named location, to endure an ongoing suffering that extends across an indefinite period rather than ending in a single decisive moment. The punishment is containment, not execution, the same structure as Dudale, the same refusal to allow destruction where containment is possible. These parallels are not arguments for a single source. They are something more interesting, an argument for a pattern that appears to be, in some sense, native to the way human beings have structured their understanding of the relationship between divine knowledge and human capacity. The gift of knowledge from a superior order, the transgression involved in giving it to beings who were not meant to have it, and the punishment that takes the form of binding, of ongoing suspended sentence, rather than the clean ending of execution. The third lens is the one that keeps this topic alive in corners of popular culture that are not primarily concerned with Second Temple theology. There are readers of this text, a not insignificant number of them, some with genuine academic backgrounds, who take the content of the Book of the Watchers as encoding something historical, not metaphorical, a record, however distorted by transmission and the passage of time, of something that actually occurred. The specificity of the curriculum is the point of entry. Not just that knowledge was given, but who gave which piece of it, in which domain, with what specific consequence. A theological argument, in the view of these readers, does not need that level of granularity. A theological argument needs the category. It does not need the named teacher and the specific subject. This reading is not accepted by mainstream scholarship. That needs to be said clearly, and with the respect the disclaimer deserves, not as a formality, but as an accurate representation of where the evidence actually sits. The mainstream scholarly consensus across biblical studies, ancient Near Eastern studies, and the history of Second Temple Judaism is that the Watcher's story is a theological construction in narrative form, not a historical record of events. That is the position of the field, based on the best current evidence. And yet the literal reading persists, and it persists for a reason worth naming honestly. The text is unusually specific about the wrong things for a theology text. Theological documents are specific about God, about correct behavior, about the consequences of deviation from correct behavior. They are not typically specific about the teaching portfolios of the beings who caused the deviation. This one is. And the specificity, the named teacher, the named subject, the administrative roster quality of the list, is what makes the literal reading feel, to a certain kind of careful reader, like it is touching something that the theological reading smooths over. That is not an argument in favor of the literal reading. It is an account of why the literal reading survives. We will leave the three lenses here, side by side, without forcing a choice between them. The rest of tonight follows the text through its own internal logic. But before we do, two things to plant. One section of this book, a substantial section, one of the 5 major parts, is completely absent from the Dead Sea Scrolls. Not damaged, not fragmentary, simply not there. No line of it was found in any of the 11 caves near Qumran. The Book of Parables, as it is known, containing the figure of the Son of Man on his throne of glory, serving as judge at the end of days, exists only in the Ethiopic manuscripts. We will come to this absence. It is also worth noting, before we move to the third lens, that the comparative mythology approach is not simply a modern academic convenience. The ancient world itself engaged in comparison. Jewish writers of the Second Temple period were aware of the Babylonian flood story, the Mesopotamian creation accounts, the Greek traditions of divine punishment. The author, or authors of the Book of the Watchers, lived in a world where these traditions circulated, where educated people read both Greek and Aramaic, where the myths of multiple cultures were known and discussed. The decision to structure the Watcher's story in a way that rhymes with the Prometheus myth, or that resonates with the Apkallu traditions, may not have been accidental. It may have been deliberate, a statement that this tradition can address the same deep questions that those traditions address, and can do so in a more satisfying way. The satisfying way, in the Book of the Watchers, is the legal way. Other traditions describe the punishment of divine beings in terms of power. Zeus chains Prometheus because Zeus is stronger. The Book of the Watchers describes the punishment in terms of procedure. There is a petition, a hearing, a ruling, a sentence, specific custodians assigned to carry out specific conditions. The God of this text does not simply overpower the Watchers. The God of this text runs a court. That is a very specific theological claim. In the Book of the Watchers, the universe is not merely powerful, it is just. And justice takes a procedural form that produces a record that can be consulted. The record, of course, is the Book of the Watchers itself. The text is presenting itself as the court record of a case that is still open. This is one of the reasons it insists on specific details, the names of the 20 leaders, the specific subjects they were assigned to teach, the specific custodians of the sentence, the specific conditions of imprisonment. Court records are specific. Legal documents are specific. A theological parable does not need to name the exact teacher of each forbidden subject. A court record does. And this brings us to what is perhaps the most honest thing we can say about the third lens before we move on. The 3 lenses are not as separate as they first appear. All 3 are responding to the same unusual feature, the text's insistence on specificity. The question is not whether the specificity is there, it obviously is. The question is what it means, and that question does not have a simple answer. It has a range of answers, each of which reveals something real about the text, and none of which is complete on its own. There is a specific tension in the Book of the Watchers that none of the 3 lenses fully resolves, and that is worth naming before we move on. The text presents itself as a legal document, a case record, a file on an open case. But it also presents itself as a warning. The warning is embedded in the structure of the text itself. This is what happened. This is why it was wrong. This is what was done about it. The reader is meant to learn from the case. But learn what, exactly? The mainstream reading says, learn that forbidden knowledge, obtained through transgression, produces catastrophe. Learn that the order of creation has limits that must be respected, and that the agents responsible for maintaining those limits will enforce them. Learn that the worst things are already handled. The comparative reading says, learn that this pattern, gift of knowledge, transgression, punishment, is universal, that it recurs across cultures not because everyone borrowed from the same source, but because the pattern is true to something real about the relationship between the available and the prohibited, the given and the taken. The literal reading says, learn that the specific things that were taught, the metalwork, the cosmetics, the astrology, carry the weight of their origin, that they were not invented by human ingenuity, but disclosed by beings from a level above the human, and that the disclosure changed the world. None of these lessons cancels the others. A text can be theology and memory and warning all at once. The most durable texts usually are. And one more thing to carry. Enoch is asked to carry a letter. He is asked, by beings he cannot refuse, to write a petition on their behalf and to deliver it. He is a human being, and they are asking him to speak for them to the God they can no longer approach. Remember that he is carrying a letter, and remember what it will cost him to read the answer aloud. Whichever lens you hold the Book of the Watchers in, whether you find it most honest to read it as theology, or as a memory of a comparative pattern, or as something you are still working out, the book agrees on what comes next. There was a trial, there was a sentence, and there was a journey to the places where things are kept. Let us follow the text where it goes. Wave 1. The earth cries out. The watchers have come down, the oaths are sworn on the mountain, the teaching begins. And from that teaching something grows, something the text describes with the patient, accumulating weight of consequence, as if the author is careful to show you each link in the chain before revealing where the chain ends. This led to this, which led to this, which led to the thing you cannot look at directly. The children of the watchers and the daughters of men were born and grew. The text gives their height as extraordinary. The specific numbers vary slightly between the Aramaic fragments, the Greek excerpts, and the Ethiopic manuscripts, suggesting this was one of the details the tradition argued about as it passed through different hands. But all versions agree on the fundamental character of the problem. These beings were too large for the world that contained them. Their hunger exceeded the world's capacity to sustain it. They consumed everything the earth could produce. And when the earth could not produce enough, they turned toward each other, and then toward everything else. The Book of the Watchers does not dwell in this violence. It is not invested in the specific texture of destruction for its own sake. Or, if it once was, the portions that survived are not the ones that describe it in detail. What the text gives you is the broad shape and the accumulating weight. Enormous beings, insatiable, in a world that has lost its ability to sustain them, and then, in a cluster of sentences whose compression makes them more powerful than any elaboration would, the most haunting line in the book's first movement. The earth brought its accusation, not metaphorically, or not only metaphorically. In the cosmological framework this text inhabits, the earth is a witness. It has legal standing to bring charges before the tribunal of heaven, and it does. The earth cries out. The text uses language that a legal scholar of the ancient Near East would recognize. The earth is filing a complaint. 4 archangels hear it. Michael, Uriel, Raphael, Gabriel, the canonical 4 who stand before God in this tradition as a standing judicial council of the highest order. They look down from heaven. They see the bloodshed and the damage and the disruption of the created order. They hear the accusation rising from below, and they bring it forward to the authority they serve. And here is where the text does something that has puzzled readers for 2,000 years. Rather than issuing a simple decree of destruction, the uncomplicated ending one might expect, the response is procedural, judicial. It names specific individuals and assigns specific remedies. Azazel, bound and imprisoned, Semjaza and the others, sentenced similarly, but in distinct terms, with distinct custodians assigned, with distinct conditions of custody, and before any of that, a human being is brought into the proceedings. Enoch, let the room settle around you. We are about to slow down. Wave 2, the petition. The text does not explain why Enoch is chosen. It simply states that the watchers, having received word of the judgment that was coming, sought him out. They came to him because he was, in the text's phrase, a righteous scribe, a man who possessed the technical skill and the moral standing to compose a formal petition, a legal document addressed upward to a higher authority, presenting the petitioner's case, requesting a reconsideration of the verdict that had been announced. They asked a human being to write their appeal. Give yourself a moment with that. 200 beings, described in the text as of the host of heaven, as entities whose proper home is a place so far above the created world that human language struggles to describe it, as beings who had existed before the creation of humanity itself, came to a human scribe, and they asked him to write their petition, because they believed or they hoped that a human being of demonstrated righteousness might have standing with God in a way that they, the condemned, no longer did. They were not able to approach. Enoch was. And so Enoch was their intermediary. He agreed. He composed the petition, the full legal document, the formal argument presenting their case, making their plea, recording their request for clemency. It was complete. It was correct in its form, and he prepared to carry it back to them with whatever answer came. But something happened first. Enoch went to the waters of Dan. The text is precise about this location, the waters of Dan, which flow from the south side of Mount Hermon, the same mountain where the oath was sworn, the same mountain whose name encodes the binding that made everything that followed necessary. He sat down there, beside the water, and read the petition over and over to himself, rehearsing it, memorizing it, preparing for the delivery. And while he sat at the waters of Dan, in the shadow of the mountain, reading the watcher's own words back to himself in the dark, he fell asleep. In the dream, clouds called to him, and mists carried him. The text takes him on a journey through territories it describes with the careful inadequacy of someone trying to render the unrenderable. A wall built of white marble and crystalline stone, surrounded by tongues of fire. A hall whose ceiling was like the path of the stars, and whose floor was made of crystal. A house within the house, built of fire, brighter than the first. And beyond the brightness, an innermost chamber where something was seated that the text does not fully describe, only approaches. And in that innermost chamber, addressed to the being he was not permitted to see directly, Enoch delivered the petition. The answer came back as words spoken in the dream. The petition was refused. The refusal is given in full in the text, and it is worth hearing. Say to them, "You have no peace. A severe judgment has gone forth against you to put you in bonds. You will not have rest or intercession. And concerning your children, you had hoped for them that they would live with you, but they shall fall before you like the fall of water, and they shall not obtain mercy for them or peace. Do not think on behalf of them that they will live, because you have hoped and prayed on their behalf with great labor. And further, say to the watchers of heaven who have sent thee to intercede for them, you should intercede for men, and not men for you. Wherefore have ye left the high, holy, and eternal heaven, and lain with women, and defiled yourselves with the daughters of men? You have done as the children of earth do, and begotten giants as your sons. And though ye were holy, spiritual, living the eternal life, you have defiled yourselves with the blood of women. The petition is denied. No reconsideration, no appeal. The case is closed. And Enoch wakes up. He is at the waters of Dan, in the shadow of Hermon, in the dark. He has the answer. And now he has to go back. He has to walk back to the place where they are waiting, because they sent him, and they are waiting for the answer, and he has it, and read them the refusal, out loud, in full. He did not write the verdict. He is not responsible for its contents. He is responsible only for the delivery. He is the messenger in the oldest sense, the one whose job it is to carry the word from where it originated to where it must arrive, regardless of what the word says. There is something almost unbearable about sitting with that quietly in the dark. A human scribe, a person with a family and a history and a specific set of skills developed in the normal course of a life, carrying a letter of rejection from the highest possible authority to 200 beings who had hoped for something different, beings who had asked for his help, beings who had believed that his advocacy might count for something. If you are still with me, somewhere in this long night, I want to ask you something. Has anyone ever asked you to carry news you did not want to carry, to say something on behalf of a situation you did not create, knowing what it would do when you said it? Leave it in the comments if you're still awake. That particular weight is one of the oldest human experiences there is, and the Book of Enoch, in its 23rd century of circulation, puts it at the structural heart of its narrative, without ceremony or editorial comment. Wave 3. The sentence Enoch goes back. He tells them. The text says they wept when they heard it. These beings, who had stood on the summit of Hermon together and sworn an oath that none could break, wept. The text does not elaborate on what the weeping looked like. It simply places them in a desolate location and gives them the word, they wept. And then the sentences are delivered, each one specific, each one assigned to a specific custodian angel with specific instructions. To Raphael, bind Azazel hand and foot, and cast him into the darkness, and make an opening in the desert, which is in Dudael, and cast him therein, and place upon him rough and jagged rocks, and cover him with darkness, and let him abide there forever, and cover his face that he may not see light, and on the day of the great judgment he shall be cast into the fire. This is the text, not a paraphrase, not a dramatic summary. The instruction as it survives in the Ethiopic, with support from the Aramaic tradition of Qumran. Bind him hand and foot. An opening in the desert. The desert is named Dudael. Rough and jagged rocks. Cover his face. Abide there forever, until the day of judgment. Now the name has arrived in full, Dudael. We planted it in the 31st minute. We will pay it in full in the 83rd minute. For now, hold the shape of it. One name, in one sentence, in one desert that is otherwise undescribed. No direction from a known point. No landscape marker. No indication of distance. Just Dudael, the entire address. To Gabriel, a separate instruction about the sons of the Watchers, the Nephilim, the giants, who are to be put under the earth, where they shall be imprisoned forever, not destroyed, put under. To Michael, the instruction concerning Semjaza and the other leaders. Bind Semjaza and his associates who have united themselves with women, so as to have defiled themselves with them in all their uncleanness. And when their sons have slain one another, and they have seen the destruction of their beloved ones, bind them fast for 70 generations in the valleys of the earth, till the day of their judgment and of their consummation, till the judgment that is for ever and ever is consummated. 70 generations in the valleys of the earth, bound. Notice what does not happen in any of these sentences. There is no destruction, no unmaking, no reversal of the being's ontology. The Watchers are not dissolved, not killed, not sent back into non-existence. They are put somewhere, under specific conditions, with specific custodians, for a specified duration, and left there to wait for an event that has not yet occurred at the time of the text's composition, and that the text presents as genuinely future. The burial is not a lesser punishment. In this text's cosmological framework, it is the strongest punishment available. A being of the order of the Watchers, a being of the host of heaven, cannot be killed. That category does not apply to such a being. You can only contain it, and the containment, if complete enough, performed under the authority of the highest court in the universe, with specific custodians assigned, with specific conditions of custody specified, and with a duration that extends to the consummation of the age. That is the maximum sentence this legal system can pass. The burial is not a compromise. It is the highest verdict. The whole Book of the Watchers is built like a legal file. Crime, discovery, petition, hearing, ruling, sentence, custody. Each element in the correct procedural order. The file is open. The sentence is running. The day of final consummation is still pending. And the book, in its current form, is the court record of a case not yet closed. Wave 4. The Journey East. The Book of the Watchers did not stay where it was written. Most ancient texts, if they survive within the channel of the culture that produced them, in the original language, within the geographic range where that language was used, maintained by the tradition that first valued it. They survive in their channel, or they disappear. The Book of the Watchers is an exception. From Aramaic, the Greek-speaking Jewish world produced a translation, or perhaps several translations. From one of those Greek translations, the Ethiopian church produced its Ge'ez version, the one that James Bruce carried out of Abyssinia in 1773. That vertical chain of transmission, Aramaic to Greek to Ge'ez, is the line that preserved the complete text through 16 centuries. It is the reason this book exists in the form we have it. But there is a second chain, running east. Among the materials found at Qumran Cave 4 was a document closely related to the Book of Enoch, but distinct from it, a companion work, an expansion of the Giants and Watchers narrative, which scholars have named the Book of Giants. It is an Aramaic text surviving in 9 or 10 manuscript copies at Qumran, which indicates it circulated widely. The Book of Giants extends the story of the Nephilim, their dreams, their premonitions of catastrophe, their attempts to understand what the visions mean, their consultations with figures who might interpret the signs. It is darker and stranger than the Book of the Watchers in some respects, more focused on the interiority of the giants themselves. In the 3rd century of the Common Era, roughly 250 years after the last copies were sealed in the Qumran caves, a man named Mani was born in Babylonia. He became the founder of Manichaeism, a religion of extraordinary intellectual ambition and missionary energy that spread from Persia westward toward the Mediterranean and, more importantly for this account, eastward, along the routes of the Silk Road, through the Iranian Plateau, through Central Asia, into China. Manichaean communities established themselves wherever the trade routes allowed. Mani and his community adopted the Book of Giants as part of their canonical scripture. They translated it into Middle Persian, into Parthian, into Sogdian, the lingua franca of the Central Asian Silk Road, and they carried it. In the early 20th century, German archaeological expeditions at the Turfan Oasis in western China, one of the great convergence points of the Silk Road, the place where caravans rested and regrouped before continuing in any direction, excavated the ruins of ancient Manichaean communities. Among the manuscripts they found were fragments of the Book of Giants, in Middle Persian, in Parthian, in Sogdian, in Old Turkic. A Coptic version from Egypt completes the picture. Each of these fragments, in its different language, is carrying the same story: the oath on the mountain, the descent, the giants, the judgment. A scholar named W.B. Henning published the first systematic analysis of the Turfan Manichaean fragments in 1943. He identified them as the Book of Giants by matching names across the language barrier. The Aramaic Shemihaza appears in the Middle Persian fragments as Shamizad. The story is recognizable across thousands of miles and hundreds of years of translation. Someone at the Turfan Oasis, in western China, a journey of months from Mount Hermon, was reading a version of a story that began with 200 beings swearing an oath on a mountain in the ancient Near East. The number 200 survived in every version. The story survived in every version. The name Dudale survived in every version. The location of Dudale survived in none of them. Expanding Wave 1. The Book of the Watchers does not want you to experience the violence directly. This is one of the most distinctive features of the text, and one of the things that makes it well suited to the sleep documentary format. The giant's destructiveness is described in the language of accumulation and consequence rather than in the language of incident. The text does not say, "They attacked this village on this date and these specific people were killed in these specific ways." It says, "The earth could not contain them, and the earth brought its accusation." The violence is described from the perspective of the ecosystem, not from the perspective of any individual victim. The earth, as a whole, registers the damage and files the complaint. This is actually a more disturbing way to describe violence than any specific incident would be. A specific incident has edges. It happened here, to these people, on this date, and when it was over, it was over. The Book of the Watchers is describing something different, a systemic disruption of the created order, a damage that has no edges and no ending, a hunger that exceeds the world's capacity to satisfy it and therefore never stops. The earth itself registers this as a wound that requires remedy, and the remedy, when it comes, is not through any human agency. No hero defeats the giants. No prophet rallies the people. No king organizes a response. The remedy comes from above, through the archangels who hear the earth's accusation and bring it to the tribunal of heaven. The only human being who plays an active role is Enoch, and his role is entirely procedural. He is the scribe. He does not fight. He writes. There is something strangely restful about that. The sense that the forces dealing with the worst problems are not human forces, that the mechanisms of cosmic justice are not dependent on any individual human being doing the right thing at the right moment. The case is being handled at a level above the one on which any of us live. Expanding Wave 2, the waters of Dan, where Enoch sits and falls asleep, are a specific and historically real place. The Dan River flows from the southern slopes of Mount Hermon, the same mountain, the same slopes, and runs through what is now northern Israel, eventually joining the Jordan. In the ancient world, the area around the headwaters of the Jordan was associated with Hermon and with the traditions attached to it. When the text places Enoch at the waters of Dan, south of Hermon, it is placing him at a real geographical location that any reader in the ancient Near East could identify. He is as close to the site of the original transgression as a human being can be while still remaining in the human world. He is at the edge of everything. There is a very old tradition, visible in legal systems as far separated as ancient Mesopotamia and medieval England, that a verdict is not binding until it is spoken aloud to the condemned. The silent verdict, the administrative note in a file, does not carry the same force as the spoken word delivered in person. The Book of the Watchers operates within this tradition. Enoch is required not because God needs a messenger. The court system requires a messenger, because the system requires that the verdict be delivered in person, in the proper form, to the people it concerns. Expanding Wave 3. The sentence on Semjaza and the other leaders, 70 generations in the valleys of the earth, implies something important about the book's understanding of time. 70 generations is a long time, but it is a finite time. It has a beginning and an end. The imprisonment of the Watchers is explicitly framed as a period of custody awaiting a final verdict, not as a final verdict in itself. We are, in the book's own reckoning, living within the 70 generations. The sentence has been issued, the custody is in effect, the final consummation has not arrived. The book is not describing a completed past event, it is describing an ongoing legal situation in which humanity is embedded. The Watchers are bound in the valleys of the earth. We are walking on those valleys. The sentence on Azazel in particular, the face covering, the darkness, the instruction that he is not to see light, is worth sitting with in the context of what Azazel taught. He taught the making of weapons and the art of cosmetics, the ornamentation of the eye, and the sentence covers his eyes. He who taught the seeing is sentenced to a blindness that is permanent until the final day. In this text, punishments tend to rhyme with crimes. The one who taught the transformation of appearance is placed in a condition where appearance no longer matters. Expanding Wave 4. The Turfan Oasis, where the Manichaean versions of the Book of Giants were found, sits on the edge of the Taklamakan Desert, in what is now the Xinjiang region of western China. It is approximately 8,000 kilometers from Mount Hermon. The story that began on a mountain in the ancient Near East, with 200 beings swearing an oath in the dark, ended up, in some form, in manuscripts read by communities living in the shadow of the world's second largest sand desert. The journey took roughly 1,000 years from the original composition. Every culture that encountered this story kept a copy. This is not simply a fact about the Book of Enoch's popularity. It is a fact about the story's structural resilience. A story that cannot survive translation, whose meaning depends entirely on cultural context, on idiom, on local reference, will not travel well. The Watcher's story travels because its core elements are not culturally specific. An oath, a summit, a descent, a teaching, a catastrophe, a trial, a sentence, a prison whose address exists but whose location nobody can find. These elements are legible in any language, in any century. They describe a pattern that is intelligible to any community that has ever asked the question of where the worst things came from, which is every community that has ever existed. There is a quality to the petition scene. Enoch sitting at the waters of Dan, reading the document aloud to himself in the dark, falling asleep mid-reading, that deserves more attention than it usually receives. The text is careful about what kind of person Enoch is before it makes him the intermediary. It does not say he is brave. It does not say he is powerful or politically connected or descended from a line of rulers. It says he is righteous, and it says he is a scribe, which, in the ancient world, meant something quite specific. A scribe was not merely someone who could read and write. A scribe was an educated professional, trained in the composition and reading of formal documents, trained in the conventions of legal and administrative writing, trained in exactly the kind of work that a petition requires. The Watchers chose Enoch not because he was the most impressive human being available to them. They chose him because he had the specific technical skill the situation required. This is a very particular vision of what righteousness means in practice. It is not the righteousness of the warrior who defeats the monster. It is not the righteousness of the prophet who calls the people back from idolatry. It is the righteousness of the professional who does his job correctly and with integrity, even when the job requires him to carry a message he did not author and to deliver it to people who will not want to hear it. The Book of Enoch, in choosing this specific figure as its human protagonist, is making a theological argument. The person through whom cosmic justice moves is not a hero. The person through whom cosmic justice moves is a scribe who shows up, does the work, and tells the truth about what the answer is. And when Enoch falls asleep at the waters of Dan, when the text has him drift into the dream that carries the refusal, it is doing something specific with the act of sleep itself. Sleep is not presented here as an escape. It is presented as the mode of communication available to a human being in contact with the divine level of reality. Enoch cannot make himself present in the divine court while he is awake. The waking world and the divine court are not on the same level, but in sleep, the membrane between levels becomes permeable. In sleep, a wind can carry him upward through the layers of a reality he cannot access while he is conscious. Sleep is, in this text, the channel through which the answer comes. This is worth holding, here, in the middle of a long night. The state you are in right now, this halfway state, where the words are reaching you from a slightly greater distance than they did at the beginning, is the state in which, according to this text, the most important communications are received. Enoch did not receive the refusal while he was sitting upright and alert at the waters of Dan. He received it in the place between waking and not waking, which is, more or less, where you are. The journey east also has a final detail worth naming before we move on. When W.B. Henning published his analysis of the Manichaean Book of Giants fragments in 1943, he was working in London during the Second World War, in a city that was being bombed. The manuscripts he was analysing had been brought from the Turfan Oasis to Berlin in the early 20th century, and from Berlin to London for safekeeping in the 1930s. The scholarly work of tracing the journey of an ancient text about imprisoned angels, from Mount Hermon to the Judean caves to Babylonia to the Silk Road, to Western China to Berlin to wartime London, was being done in a city under attack, in the middle of a century that produced its own catastrophes beyond any ancient scale. The study of how the worst things are contained is not an abstract exercise. It never has been. The Silk Road journey of the Book of Giants tells us something about what the story was for, beyond its specific theological claims. Every community that adopted it was a community living with some version of the Watcher's problem. Powers had been unleashed, damage had been done, and the question of who was responsible and how the situation was being managed was not a theoretical one. The Manichaeans were a persecuted community across most of their history. They lived under empires that did not welcome their presence. The Book of Giants, with its account of imprisoned powers and pending judgments, was not escapism for them. It was a framework for understanding the world they actually lived in. Every tradition that carried the sentence carried the name. No tradition produced a map. And that, more than any other single fact about this text, is the thing worth sitting with quietly, here in the dark of a long night. The address existed. The address was preserved. The place the address pointed to was never confirmed. And that brings us to the part of the book that almost nobody quotes. Because after the sentence is passed, the custody arrangements are in place, and the legal file is formally open. Enoch is taken on a journey. Not on earth, not in history. He is carried by winds, past mountains, to the places where things are kept. And what he is shown there is the book's most hypnotic material. This is the section of the Book of Enoch that tends to disappear from popular accounts. The legal proceedings, the fallen angels, the oath on the mountain, these are vivid, dramatic, and they compress well into summary. They are the parts that get quoted, debated, made into films and documentaries and late-night lectures. But after the sentence is passed, the text does not end. The Book of the Watchers continues for 19 more chapters, and in those chapters Enoch is not released from his role and returned to his ordinary life. He is taken somewhere, carried by winds, past mountains, to the places where things are stored. And what he is shown there is the book's most hypnotic material, the part that reads most like something experienced and recorded, rather than something argued and assembled. The tour begins in chapter 17. And they took and brought me to a place in which those who were there were like flaming fire, and, when they wished, they appeared as men. And they brought me to the place of darkness, and to a mountain the point of whose summit reached to heaven. The guides are not precisely named at this stage. Raphael and other angels accompany the tour. Uriel appears as the primary interpreter for certain passages. What matters for our purposes is the itinerary, the sequence of what Enoch is shown, and what he is told about each thing. First, a place of darkness, with a mountain whose summit reaches heaven. The text offers no further description of this mountain beyond its height. It is a threshold, the first marker in a geography that does not correspond to any terrestrial map. Then, a place where rivers of water flow together from different directions. The text describes their colors and their properties in terms that suggest these are not ordinary rivers. They carry something other than ordinary water, in colors that cannot be rendered in the vocabulary of terrestrial hydrology. The text struggles here. It reaches for comparison, and the comparison falls short. Then, a place where fire neither rests nor ceases. Fire that does not go out, fire that does not settle, fire that exists in a condition of permanent activity without consuming anything. Enoch looks at it and cannot describe it adequately. The text admits the inadequacy. This is honest. A text that was purely invented would not struggle this way. A text that was trying to render something it had no adequate framework for would struggle exactly this way. And then, beyond all of that, something that has no clear parallel in any tradition that precedes this text. And I saw a deep abyss with columns of heavenly fire, and among them I saw columns of fire fall, which were beyond measure alike towards the height and towards the depth. And beyond that abyss I saw a place which had no firmament of the heaven above, and no firmly founded earth beneath it. There was no water upon it, and no birds, but it was a waste and horrible place, no heaven above, no earth beneath, a place outside the structural order of creation, not a place of punishment exactly, not yet, but a place that exists outside the architecture of the cosmos. The cosmos, in this text understanding, is built of layers, heaven above, earth below, water above and below the earth, the vault that separates them. Every place in the created order is locatable within this structure. This place is not. It has no position within the cosmos because it is outside the cosmos. It is a pocket of negation inside an otherwise ordered universe, a space that exists but is not organized by any of the principles that make existence navigable. No sky, no ground, no birds, no water. Just the waste and the horrible and the dark. Uriel, who is Enoch's guide at this point in the tour, tells him what it is. This place is the end of heaven and earth. This has become a prison for the stars and the host of heaven. The prison for the stars. Give yourself a moment with this image. Let the room be dark around you. Let it be quiet. In the cosmology of the Book of Enoch, the stars are not inert burning objects moving through the void by mechanical necessity. They are beings, or they inhabit beings, or they are beings who have been assigned to the positions and movements and schedules of what we call stars. They have duties, they have a commandment, appear at the appointed time, rise when you are required to rise, follow the order that was assigned to you at the beginning of things. And some of them, the text says, have not done this. They have transgressed, not in a dramatic way, not through violence or through the kind of boundary crossing that the Watchers committed. They have transgressed through absence, through failing to appear when they were scheduled to appear, through not rising at their appointed times. The crime is not commission, the crime is omission, and the sentence for omission is the same structure as the sentence for commission, containment, in the place outside the created order, for a duration that is given precisely. And I saw 7 stars like great burning mountains, and to me, when I inquired regarding them, the angel said, "This place is the end of heaven and earth. This has become a prison for the stars and the host of heaven. And the stars which roll over the fire are they which have transgressed the commandment of the Lord in the beginning of their rising, because they did not come forth at their appointed times. And he was wroth with them, and bound them till the time when their guilt should be consummated, even for 10,000 years. 10,000 years. 10,000 years in an abyss with no heaven above and no earth beneath, for failing to rise on schedule. The sentence for cosmic lateness, for not showing up when the order required it. The stone somewhere beneath you, the floor, the ground. Feel the solidity of it if you can. You are on earth. You are under a sky. You are in the created order. These are things the text, in describing their absence, makes vivid by contrast. Breathe. Stay with the image as long as you like. 7 burning mountains in a place without horizon, in a darkness that has no edges, counting out 10,000 years. And then Enoch is taken further, to a mountain, described as a mountain of hard rock, as if the texture of the stone is important. in which there are 4 hollow places, 4 chambers inside the mountain, 3 of them dark, 1 of them bright, with a fountain of water in it, and a light that the text describes as bright but does not explain. And Enoch looks at these hollow places and asks his guide what they are and who is in them. And Raphael answered, "One of the holy angels who was with me, and said unto me, These hollow places have been created for this very purpose, that the spirits of the souls of the dead should assemble therein, yea, that all the souls of the children of men should assemble here. And these places have been made to receive them till the day of their judgment, until their appointed period." The dead do not go to a place of immediate judgment in this text. They do not go to an instant heaven or an instant condemnation. They go to a mountain. They go into hollow places inside the mountain, sorted, separated, arranged by category, and they wait. 3 chambers in the dark, 1 with a spring and a light. And Raphael explains the sorting. The bright chamber with the flowing water is for the righteous who were murdered, those who cried out and were not heard in their lifetimes, kept here in a condition of readiness for the judgment that will eventually vindicate them. The 3 dark chambers are for the sinners, sorted by degree, those who were not punished in life in proportion to their deeds, those who were accomplices rather than architects, those who are awaiting an accounting that has not yet arrived. Nothing is resolved yet. The judgment has not come. The verdict has not been delivered. All of these souls, from every generation, from the beginning of the world's population to the moment of Enoch's vision, are in the hollow places of a mountain somewhere, in conditions that anticipate but do not consummate the final accounting, just waiting. The word the text uses for their condition is not imprisonment, it is reception. The mountain has been created to receive them. They are being held, in the specific sense that a holding cell holds someone, not punished yet, not vindicated yet, simply held in the condition that is appropriate to the period between the crime and the verdict. There is something in this that is genuinely suited to the middle of a long night. Not because waiting is comfortable, it is not, but because you know what this condition is. The night between knowing something and having to act on it. The state of being suspended between what happened and what it means. The particular quality of time in a room where nothing decisive is happening yet, and everything is still possible. Now, Dudael. We planted this name in the 31st minute. We partially paid it in the 66th, when the sentence was delivered. Here is the full account. The sentence on Azazel names exactly 1 piece of geography. The opening in the desert is in Dudael. That is the entire locational information provided by the text. No direction from a known landmark. No topographic description. No indication of which desert, since the ancient Near East contained many deserts, and the text specifies none of them. No distance to travel, just the name, Dudael. Scholars who have worked on this name have proposed etymologies. The most commonly cited parsing reads it from Hebrew components, du or dud, meaning something like cauldron or pot or hollow, combined with el, the generic Semitic word for the divine, the cauldron of God, the hollow place of God, a vessel set apart for sacred or terrible purpose. Others have proposed a connection to the scapegoat ritual in Leviticus, the 16th chapter, where on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, a goat is sent into the wilderness, sent to Azazel. The Mishnah, the compilation of oral legal traditions completed around 200 years into the Common Era, describes the cliff from which that goat was cast as Beth Hadudo, and later as Beth Harudo. This has been tentatively identified with a site in the Judean desert east of Jerusalem, possibly a peak called Jabal Muntar. This identification is a serious scholarly proposal, made by serious scholars using serious textual reasoning. It is not the consensus, because no consensus exists. It is one of several serious proposals, none of which the available evidence can confirm. The name Dudael has travelled further and more faithfully than almost any other element of this text. It is in the Aramaic fragments from Qumran. It is in the Greek excerpts preserved by George Syncellus in the 9th century. It is in the Ethiopic Ge'ez manuscripts. It is in the Manichaean versions that travelled east to the Turfan oasis. Every tradition that has carried the sentence on Azazel has carried the name. The name has been copied in scripts that did not exist when it was first committed to leather. It has been spoken in languages the original scribes had never heard. It has travelled from the Judean wilderness to the Chinese frontier. And in all of that travelling, in all of those languages, across all of those centuries, no tradition produced a location. The name arrived everywhere. The coordinates arrived nowhere. The sentence has an address. The address has no map. And in the text's own reckoning, since the sentence is not a past event resolved and archived, but an ongoing condition, since the prisoner is still bound, and the face still covered, and the day of final consummation still pending, whatever is at Dudael is still there, still under the rough and jagged rocks, still in the darkness, still waiting for the event the text calls the Great Judgment, toward which the entire narrative is oriented without ever arriving at it. Consider what the text is actually saying when it chooses containment over destruction. In a cosmology where spiritual beings cannot be killed, where the category of death does not apply to entities of the order of the Watchers, the only available response to the worst possible transgression is the most complete possible containment. And the most complete possible containment is what Dudael provides. Bound hand and foot, face covered, stones placed on top, in the dark, forever. Not for a term, forever. Until the day that supersedes forever, the day of the great consummation, the day the text describes as coming but does not claim has arrived. The burial is not the end of the story. It is the strongest statement the story can make without the story being over. Before we move to the 4 hollow chambers, let us sit for a moment in the abyss without heaven and earth, because it is worth asking what this place is, cosmologically, in the text's own framework. The cosmos of the Book of Enoch is layered. There is the earth, the created surface of the world, bounded by water. There is the heaven above, the realm of the divine court and its servants. There is the sky between them, through which the stars move according to their assigned schedules. And there are, apparently, spaces that exist outside this tripartite structure. The abyss without heaven or earth is one of these. It is not above the earth. It is not below it. It is not between heaven and earth. It is outside the whole system, a negative space within the positive structure of creation. The stars imprisoned there did not fall from their positions. They failed to occupy their positions. They were scheduled to appear, and they did not appear. And so they were removed from the system entirely, placed in the space that is not part of the system, the space that has no sky and no ground, because the sky and the ground belong to a system that runs on schedules, and these stars were disqualified from participation by their failure to follow the schedule. A deviation from the schedule is not a minor infraction in this text's cosmology. It is a fundamental violation of the created order, and the punishment is exclusion from the order itself. This is a very specific theological vision. The universe runs on time. The whole created order is, fundamentally, a vast and precise system, and the beings assigned to maintain it are required to maintain it precisely. You failed to appear on time. You are placed where there is no time, no sky, no ground, no reference point, just the waste and the horrible and the dark. There is something in the image of the 4 hollow chambers that is deeply resonant with how sleep feels at its deepest. The sense of being held, somewhere dark and safe, in a condition that is neither waking nor death, but simply suspension. The dead in this text are waiting the way you sometimes wait, for something that cannot be hurried, in a condition that has its own particular texture of time. In the dark, in the middle of the night, in a holding place between the day that ended and the day that has not yet begun, the 7 burning stars, the stars imprisoned in the abyss for failing to rise at their appointed times, are described in a way that makes them simultaneously enormous and diminished. They are like great burning mountains, the text says. Mountains burning, but they are in a place where the scale of mountains means nothing, because there is no ground against which to measure a mountain's height, and no sky against which to measure its reach. They burn in the void, in a space outside the structure of creation, for 10,000 years. The burning does not consume them. In the logic of this text, a spiritual being cannot be consumed by fire any more than it can be killed by a sword. The fire is their condition, not their end. They burn, and they wait. There is a question the text raises but does not fully answer. What is it like to be one of those stars? What does it mean to exist for 10,000 years in a place outside the created order? The text does not give the stars an inner life. It does not report their weeping, as it reports the weeping of the watchers. It simply describes what is there: 7 burning mountains, in the waste and the horrible and the dark. But the question it raises by describing them at all is the question of duration. What is 10,000 years from the inside? The text does not answer this. It simply names the number, and the weight of the number is its own answer. A very long time, too long to imagine. Long enough that the original transgression, the failure to rise on schedule, the celestial equivalent of missing an appointment, has become irrelevant to the description of the punishment. The punishment has entirely superseded the crime in temporal scale. Enoch's guide, Uriel, does not seem troubled by any of this. He answers Enoch's questions with the steady efficiency of a case manager who has been through this tour many times. This is the prison for the stars. This is why they are here. This is the duration of their sentence. The explanations are brisk and complete. The abyss does not disturb Uriel the way it disturbs Enoch, who is a human being confronting a space outside the architecture of the world he was born into. Uriel knows where things are, because Uriel is part of the system that maintains them. For Enoch, every part of the tour is a revelation. For Uriel, it is an itinerary, and this contrast is itself a piece of theology. The text is showing us what the universe looks like from 2 perspectives simultaneously: the perspective of the being who administers it, for whom the prisons and the hollow chambers and the abyss are simply the infrastructure of cosmic justice doing its work, and the perspective of the human being who has been given, briefly, a view from outside the level he normally occupies. Enoch is the reader's surrogate. His astonishment at what he sees is our astonishment. His questions are the questions any reader would ask, and the answers he receives, brisk, specific, complete, are the answers the text wants its readers to have. The universe is structured. The worst things are accounted for. Someone has the itinerary. What a text is saying when it builds this structure, when it insists that the worst things are bound and sealed and waiting rather than ended, is something very specific about how it understands time. Time, in the Book of the Watchers, is the interval between a sentence and its final execution. We are living in that interval. We have always been living in that interval. The book was written in that interval, and copied in that interval, and carried east and west and south in that interval, and read tonight in that interval. The interval is very long. The text does not pretend it is short, but it insists that the interval is structured, that there is a legal order within it, that the worst things are accounted for within it, that the holding pattern is not chaos but custody. And now it is time to come back up, to say plainly what we actually know, what the book actually is, what it honestly is not, and what remains either way. The Book of the Watchers was written by human beings. Not because that settles the question of what they were writing about, it does not. What human beings write can record experience or theology or pattern or imagination or memory, and the category is often less clear than it appears from the outside. But it is worth beginning the return with this. The oldest Aramaic manuscript in the Qumran collection, the one designated 4Q201, is leather. cut from an animal, scraped, dried, ruled with faint lines to guide the scribe, and inscribed with a reed pen in ink that chemical analysis confirms is consistent with the ink formulations of the 2nd and 1st centuries before the Common Era. A real hand held the pen. A real person chose every word of that copy, working from an earlier copy, working from the tradition they had received. Someone, in the 2nd century before the Common Era, sat down and spent time, careful, patient, professional time, copying a document about 200 beings who had descended on a mountain and been imprisoned in a desert. And they believed this document was worth copying carefully, on good material, in a professional hand, and preserving in a sealed jar in a cave in the Judean desert. And the jar held, and the cave held, and 2,000 years later, in the winter of 1946 to 1947, a young shepherd threw a stone and heard pottery break. The chain of custody between that scribe and tonight is unbroken. It passes through the Qumran cave and through Joseph Millick's hands, and through the publication of 1976, and through the scholarly literature, and through this documentary, and through wherever you are right now, in the dark, listening. Let us now resolve the question that has been open since the 3rd minute of this night. The master question, as it was stated then. What does the Book of Enoch say is buried beneath the earth, and why sealed rather than destroyed? What is buried, the text says, is Azazel, bound hand and foot, his face covered against the light, in an opening in the desert called Dudale, under rough and jagged stones. With him, in the valleys of the earth, the remaining watchers, bound for 70 generations. And in the hollow places of the mountain, the souls of the dead, not punished yet, not vindicated yet, simply held until the day of their appointed accounting, the burial rather than the destruction. Here is why, in the text's own terms, the Book of the Watchers is not operating in a cosmology where spiritual beings can be killed. That option does not exist within the framework this text inhabits. A being of the order of the Watchers, a being of the host of heaven, a member of the divine assembly, cannot be ended in the way that a mortal being can be ended. The category of death does not apply. The mechanism is not available. What is available is containment, and the containment, if complete enough, if performed under the authority of the highest possible court, with the specific conditions specified, and the specific custodians assigned, and the specific duration defined, that is the strongest verdict this legal system can deliver. The burial is not a compromise with a more severe punishment that could not be arranged. The burial is the most severe punishment available within this cosmology. It is the maximum sentence. And the Book of the Watchers, which is structured, from its opening vision through its closing chapters, as a legal document, delivers that maximum sentence with the procedural thoroughness that a maximum sentence requires. Crime, the unauthorized descent, the unauthorized union, the unauthorized disclosure of knowledge. Discovery, the earth's accusation, heard by the archangels. Petition, the legal argument prepared by the righteous scribe, delivered to the court in a dream. Hearing, the petition is received and refused, the refusal given with reasons. Ruling, the verdict pronounced. Sentence, specific, individual, with specific custodians and specific conditions. Custody, ongoing, with a specified duration extending to the consummation of the age. The file is open. The sentence is running. The day of consummation is still pending. And here is the honest resolution of the master loop that has been open since the beginning of this night. Whether anything is physically under any desert in the ancient Near East is not a question this text was designed to answer, and it is not a question that the available evidence can settle. The Book of the Watchers does not give us coordinates. It gives us a name, Dudale, and that name has never been securely resolved to a location in over 2 millennia of interpretation. What the evidence can tell us is something different, that a very large number of people, across a very long period, across a very wide range of languages and cultures, needed this story to be true. Not true in a factual sense necessarily. True in the sense that stories are true, useful, load-bearing, capable of answering questions that cannot otherwise be answered. The question was, where did evil come from, in a universe created by a God described as entirely good? And, has anything been done about it? The Watcher's story answers both. Evil entered through a specific event, by specific actors, through a specific mechanism. The actors are identified and sentenced. The sentence is running. The handling has occurred. The file is open, but the management is in place. Whatever damage remains visible in the world, whatever weapons exist, whatever misuses of knowledge persist, whatever ornaments and enchantments and readings of the stars continue to carry the ambiguity the text describes, the being responsible for the original disclosure is under the stones in a named desert, waiting for the day that will finally close the file. That is a very specific kind of reassurance. Not that everything is fine, not that the damage is undone, but that the worst thing has already been sentenced and is already in custody, and you do not need to manage it tonight. Now let me pay two things that have been waiting since early in this night. The number 200. 200 was planted in the hook of this documentary. It was echoed when we read the oath passage. It has travelled with us through every segment of the night. And here is what it has done across time, in the actual historical record. The number 200, specifically 200, not a round number in a larger sense, not a generalization, appears in the Aramaic Qumran tradition, represented by 4Q201 and related manuscripts, in copies dated to 200 years before the Common Era. It appears in the Ethiopic Ge'ez text that James Bruce carried out of Abyssinia in 1773, and that Richard Lawrence put into English in 1821. It appears in the Greek excerpts that the Byzantine chronicler George Syncellus preserved in the 9th century of the Common Era. They were in all 200, who descended on the summit of Mount Hermon in the days of Jared. It appears in the Manichaean Aramaic tradition of the 3rd century, and it appears in the fragments that the Manichaean missionaries carried to the Turfan oasis in western China. In W.B. Henning's 1943 translation, the 200 demons came down from the high heaven. 200. In Aramaic, in Greek, in Ge'ez, in Middle Persian, in Old Turkic. The number crossed 4 continents of transmission history. It was preserved in every branch, in every language, in every century of the text's circulation. It is the most stable element of the entire narrative. The location, Dudael, is the least stable, not because it was not preserved. The name was preserved faithfully in every tradition, but because the name was never resolved. The address survived. The location the address pointed to was never confirmed by any tradition, in any language, in any century. 200 crossed 4 continents. Dudael crossed none, in the sense that matters. And the second thing. The Book of Parables, the section of 1 Enoch containing the Son of Man on his throne of glory, containing some of the most elevated cosmological material in the entire Enochic tradition. The section that I planted a reference to in the 14th minute, and mentioned again in the reinterpretation segment. Not a fragment of it was found at Qumran. In 11 caves. In hundreds of manuscripts. Multiple Enochic texts confirmed. And the Book of Parables, chapters 37 through 71 of the complete text as the Ethiopic tradition has it, is simply absent. J.T. Millick, working with the Qumran Enoch fragments through the 1960s and publishing in 1976, argued that the absence meant the Book of Parables had been composed after the period of the Qumran community, perhaps as late as the 3rd century of the Common Era. He proposed a date around 270 CE, making it a late and possibly Christian-influenced composition. That position has been largely set aside by subsequent scholarship. The current consensus among specialists in early Jewish literature places the Book of Parables in the period around the turn of the era, late 1st century before the Common Era, or early 1st century of the Common Era, Jewish in authorship, pre-Christian in composition. Why it was not at Qumran remains genuinely open. The Qumran community had access to other Enochic material. Why they did not have this section, or did not preserve it, is a question the evidence cannot currently answer. Now hold this alongside what we said in segment 5, about how much of the Aramaic text is missing. The Qumran fragments cover roughly 1/5 of the complete Ethiopic text. 4/5 of the original Aramaic tradition has been lost. Not hidden, not deliberately withheld, just lost to time. The book we have is already a diminished version of whatever originally existed. We are reading what survived the loss of 4/5 of itself. And still, the sentence on Azazel is in there. The name Dudael is in there. The hollow chambers in the mountain are in there. The 7 burning stars in the prison beyond creation are in there. The roster of the teachers, with their specific assigned subjects, is in there. Enoch and his letter are in there. 200 is in there. Somewhere between what was written and what survived, this book lost most of itself. And it still says more than most books that survived intact. Real hands, real reed pens, real leather, real ink, real people who sat down in the 2nd century before the Common Era and believed this was worth preserving. Real people who carried the Ge'ez manuscripts out of Abyssinia on long, difficult journeys. Real people who sealed the Aramaic scrolls in jars in caves and did not come back for them. There is a detail in the transmission history of the Book of Enoch that has not yet been mentioned, and that is worth naming now. The chain of transmission that preserved the complete text is a story about the persistence of communities that believed something was worth keeping. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church did not preserve the Book of Enoch simply because no one ever told them not to. They preserved it because they considered it authoritative, because it was integrated into their liturgical tradition, because generations of priests learned to read it in Ge'ez as part of their formation, because communities gathered to hear it read aloud. The preservation was active, not passive. Someone made a decision, in every generation, to include this book in the canon of what was worth teaching. Someone made a decision, in every generation, to copy it when the old copy wore out, to read it when the liturgical calendar called for it, to explain it when a question was asked. 16 centuries of active, intentional preservation. James Bruce, arriving in Abyssinia in 1769, did not find a forgotten document in a dusty archive. He found a living tradition that had been carrying this text for longer than European Christianity had been a coherent institution. The 3 manuscripts he brought back were not relics. They were copies of a text that was still in use. For 16 centuries, in one part of the world, the Book of Enoch was scripture, as ordinary as Genesis, as familiar as the Psalms. In the rest of the world, it was a mystery, a rumor, a fragment, quoted in Jude and then lost. The same text, 2 completely different fates, depending entirely on which community was responsible for preserving it. And this is, perhaps, the deepest thing the Book of Enoch has to say to us tonight. Deeper than anything in its cosmological architecture, deeper than the 7 burning stars or the 4 hollow chambers or the sentence on Azazel. It says, there are traditions other than the ones you were taught. There are things that were worth keeping that were kept, quietly, by communities that nobody thought to ask. The absence of something from the tradition you know does not mean it was lost. It may mean it was kept somewhere you have not yet looked. Someone sat down and wrote out, in careful detail, the entire legal defense for beings they believed had ruined the world, and the sentence, and the address of the prison, and the tour of the places where things are kept. That is what we have. That is what survived. We still do this, not the specific ritual of it, not the oath on the mountain, or the Aramaic petition, or the sentence delivered in a dream, or the rough and jagged rocks placed on top of an opening in a named desert. But the essential act, the act of taking something we cannot destroy, cannot end, cannot resolve through any mechanism currently available to us, and choosing to seal it rather than finish it, choosing to put it somewhere specific, to cover it over, to mark it with a duration, and to say, this is for later, this is for the day that has not arrived yet. We do not know when the day will be. We know only that we cannot close this file today. We build containers for what we cannot end. In the late 20th century, engineers and policymakers designing geological repositories for nuclear waste had to confront a version of exactly the problem the Book of Enoch is solving. The waste they were designing to contain would remain dangerous for 10,000 years, the same unit of time the book assigns to the imprisonment of the stars who transgressed. 10,000 years. And the question they had to answer was, how do you build a warning marker that will remain legible across that span? How do you say do not open in a language that will survive the death of all the languages you currently know? Anthropologists and linguists and semioticians were consulted, seriously, in the 1990s. The problem was not considered trivial. It is not trivial. It is the same problem the Book of the Watchers was solving in the 3rd century before the Common Era. How do you mark something as sealed, something as dangerous, something as contained and awaiting its final accounting, in a way that will survive the forgetting that takes most of what we write? The answer the Book of Enoch gives is, you give it a name. You put the name in a document. You give the document to a community that will preserve it. And you build the community around a faith that does not allow them to set it down. That is, roughly speaking, what happened. For 23 centuries, we bury our records in time capsules and specify the opening date. We hold archives classified for 50 years, for 100 years, for in perpetuity. We have national and cultural memories that are not processed but held, kept in suspension, not brought to their conclusion, for a generation that has not yet been born to receive them. We keep the things we cannot release, the knowledge we cannot act on yet, the decisions we are not ready to make. We mark them with a date, or with a condition, or simply with the word later. Every culture builds a container for what it cannot end. Every individual has a dewdale, a named place in some personal desert where something is being held, under the ordinary stones of daily life, awaiting the appointed day. Not this week, not this year, but eventually, when the conditions are right, when the judgment can finally be carried through. The text does not pretend the day will come soon. It does not pretend the interval is short. It simply insists that the interval is structured, that the worst things are in custody within it, that the holding pattern is not chaos but order. The question the Book of Enoch leaves you with, at the bottom of a long, quiet night, is not where Dewdale is. The text itself does not know where Dewdale is. It has given you the name, and that is all it has. The question it leaves you with is something older and closer than a desert address. It is the question of what it means that the answer to the worst thing you can imagine is always, at some level, in some tradition, across some span of time, not destruction, but bind it, cover it, wait for the day. There is something honest in that answer, something that does not pretend the worst things can be ended by will, or by violence, or by the simple courage of not thinking about them anymore. Something that says, we have done what we can do, we have named it, and sentenced it, and put it somewhere, and the somewhere has a name, and the name will be carried forward. And the day will come. You know what that holding pattern feels like from the inside. Everyone does. The night between knowing and acting. The year between the decision and the consequence. The long suspension of something that has not yet been resolved, that you cannot force to resolution, that you can only keep in the place you have made for it, and trust that the appointed day will eventually arrive. The Book of Enoch understood this 23 centuries ago. It built its entire cosmological architecture around it. If you have found tonight useful, and I hope you have, A quiet tap-on like before you close your eyes is one of the most generous things you can do. It tells the algorithm that this kind of night is worth showing to more people who need it. And if you have questions about the manuscript tradition, about what Dudale might mean, about the Book of Parables and its strange absence, about the Manichaean Book of Giants and how it reached China, leave them in the comments. I read them carefully, and they shape what comes next. Subscribe, if you are not already, so that the next night arrives without you having to search for it. Something older and quieter is already being prepared. Membership is there if you want to go deeper, to follow the sources more slowly, to spend more time with the texts themselves. The link is where you can find it. But none of this is required. Watching and listening and resting here is already more than enough. There is a mountain on the border between Syria and Lebanon. Right now, tonight, as you drift and the words reach you from a more distant place than they did at the beginning of the night, there is snow on its summit. The lights of the villages below have been going out one by one for hours. A small team of soldiers is awake in the outpost at the top, watching 3 countries in the dark, the way someone has been watching from that summit for as long as anyone in the region has written anything down. The oath was sworn on that mountain, if the text is accurate about where it happened. The mountain is still there. The Semitic root that gives it its name, the ban, the devoted thing, the vow from which there is no return, is still in the word, 23 centuries after someone wrote it down for the first time. Whatever is in the desert the text calls Dudale, whatever waits under the rough and jagged stones in the opening that was made for it, is still there, in the text's own reckoning, still bound, still with its face covered against the light, still waiting for the day the text calls the Great Judgment. Over 2 millennia of interpretation, in 6 languages, across 4 continents, have not located it. The name has travelled, the address has not arrived, the sentence is still running, and there is something restful in that, if you can let it be restful, not because injustice is peaceful, but because the text is making a specific promise. The worst thing is already handled, already sentenced, already in custody. The case is open, but it is not unmanaged. The holding pattern is not chaos. It is order. The order of a legal system that knows how to wait, that has been waiting, that will continue to wait until the appointed day. You do not need to manage it tonight. The mountain can wait until morning. Dudale, wherever it is, in whatever desert it lies unnamed and unlocated, can wait until morning. The Book of Enoch, with its 11 caves and its 4/5 missing, and its single named desert, and its 200 who swore an oath on a summit in the dark, and its 1 human scribe who carried a letter and came back and had to read the refusal aloud, all of it can wait until morning. You have stayed with this long enough. You have followed it further down than most people follow anything in the late hours of a long night. And now the words can become just sound, and the sound can become just rhythm, and the rhythm can become just the sense of a voice moving through a quiet room, while the world outside does what the world outside does. It has waited 3,000 years. It can wait until morning. The mountain can wait until morning. There is a related and more personal version of this question that the Book of Enoch poses, if you let it. Not the cosmic version, not the question of what is buried in Dudale, or what the scholars have argued about the Book of Parables, but the version that exists at the scale of a single life. What do you keep? What have you been keeping? In the rough and jagged rocks of a daily life, under the weight of everything that needed to be done today, that is waiting for the day of its appointed accounting. Not the worst thing, not the Azazel-level catastrophe, just the ordinary Dudale of an ordinary life, the conversation you have not finished, the relationship whose verdict has not yet been delivered, the decision that has been running in the background for a duration you have stopped counting. The Book of Enoch does not judge you for having a Dudale. It treats the keeping of a dudale as the only honest response to the existence of things that cannot be resolved today. The legal structure of the book is not a condemnation of the interval between crime and verdict. It is a description of what that interval looks like when it is properly managed. The case is open, the custody is in place, the record exists. The day will come. All of the things that have been waiting, in you, in the world, in the texts that were sealed in caves and kept in liturgies and carried along trade routes to the far ends of the earth, can wait a little longer. The mountain waited 23 centuries before anyone found the Aramaic manuscripts. Dudael has waited the entire history of this text transmission. Everything that deserves a proper accounting will eventually receive one. Not tonight. Tonight you rest. The world can wait until morning. For now, you can rest. V.